When did you first meet Castro?
In 1948, but you wouldn't recognize this Castro. This Castro was always wearing a double-breasted jacket because he had a pistol underneath. He didn't have a beard. He has a very receding chin, and he was curious about people like me who used to gather on a given corner of Havana, and who were supposed to be for him the four-eyed intellectuals.
You're saying he was a pistolero?
He was a gangster, of course. He was a street gangster with an organization called UIR, UIR, that was very well known at the time. If you read the newspapers for 1948, 1949, 1950, you'll see the name of Fidel Castro as one of the gangsters in this group.
Did you have any respect for him after Moncada, during his period in jail, during his trial, during the years in the Sierra Maestra?
Of course, he was seen at the time as a guiding kind of political leader. The attack on the Moncada was a mismatch operation because it failed miserably, and also because many people were killed, not only the attackers but also the attacked, that had nothing to do truly with Batista. They were simply soldiers, many humble people. But his exploits in the Sierras was very much admired at the time, and I was an admiring journalist.
Can you remember your emotions when you heard that Batista had fled, and then later that Fidel had taken over?
Oh, it was totally overwhelming, but very different from what happens in the movies you've seen about that time. Let's see, an American movie called Havana, which is a disaster, and a very good American movie called Godfather Part 2. At the time, very few people knew. I mean, during a few hours, during the early morning of 1959, there were very, very people who was actually in the know of what was going on. I remember receiving a call from the editor-in-chief of Carteles magazine, for which I was a movie critic. And then I called several other people, and it was confirmed that Batista has fled. But he fled in the at midnight 1958. And I remember going from one place to another in Havana because we were not sure that the phones were not tapped, waking up people who didn't know that Batista had fled.
And how soon was it clear that Castro was taking over? Because the army did try to form a government after Batista had fled.
Yes, they did, but the army went from being sitting ducks to being dead ducks. They were cut off completely because of Batista's fleeing the way he did. I mean, the true responsible in the army fled together with Batista. And I remember going to the Colombia camp, which was where all the Batista troops were gathered at the time, on January the 3rd. And I was dressed in a simple shirt, and these colonels and generals of Batista were calling me Comandante, which was a measure of the fear they had. But that was a moment of elation.
Were you there when Castro entered Havana?
Yes, of course.
And what sort of crowd was there? What sort of reception?
Oh, an enormous crowd. He was a hero. He was the savior. He was some sort of political messiah.
When did you first realize personally that the revolution was going wrong?
No, I personally sensed that everything was going to be wrong, not the revolution, but everything in Cuba, when I was together with Castro on the first trip he took to Washington, and then to Canada, and then later to Brazil and Argentina. I thought I saw him, because I only saw him on television when he came down from the Sierras. And on that night, his delivery, when the things he said were incredible for somebody who knew him as a gangster. There was a sea change, really, in him. But on this trip, I realized that he was the same bully that he was before, and that we would be in trouble. But it's very difficult, really, to live in your country. Is not like living your political party. It's a major event in anybody's life. And that's why it took me how many years, until 65, to be able to flee from Cuba.
When was that trip that you talked about with Castro to the States and elsewhere?
That was April 1959. He first went from Havana to Washington, and I remember seeing for the first time one of his incredible rages, because he wasn't received by President Eisenhower, but by Vice President Richard Nixon. When he came from his interview with Nixon, I was in the embassy, in the Cuban embassy where he was staying. And of course, he was able to restrain himself until he was in the embassy. And when he was in his room, in his bedroom at the embassy, it was like a bull, like a very like a madman, really, because he was angry that this is something very important for him. He had been somehow belittled by Eisenhower. He went there to meet the President of the United States, and instead he met the Vice President. And for him, this was a tremendous slight.
When did you